Well, good morning, everybody. Is this on? Yes. Today we're going to talk about how aggregate output is determined in the economy. I think it's a good topic for Halloween because it's downright scary. The topic arose, the issue arose during the Great Depression. Up until that time, economists had just assumed that equilibrium in the macroeconomy necessarily occurred when there's full employment, that markets would equilibrate until demand for labor is equal to supply of labor, and whoever wants to get a job could get a job. And then the Great Depression hit, and it seemed that that just was not true. We were sitting in a period, equilibrium is defined as where there's no tendency for change. We were sitting in a period where it seemed there was no tendency for change, and yet there was massive unemployment. How is it? This was the problem that was facing economists at that time, of trying to figure out how is the reality of what's happening consistent with what we were thinking should be happening in an economy, that things should adjust in some way or another to move towards full employment. And it was the thought about this that led John Maynard Keynes to come up with the initial ideas that have then later been refined by a whole slew of people over the years. Essentially, the result throws the question back. As you'll see, the question kind of becomes, why would you ever expect equilibrium at full employment? So anyway, the answer was to that very specific question of how can we have people looking for jobs in an equilibrium situation and without any tendency for things to change. And answering that question actually answered the bigger question of how is the aggregate output level of the economy determined? So it was looking at a kind of narrow issue that then gave rise to the understanding of the overall issue. Once we understand how the aggregate output of the economy is determined, then we can implement tools to try to affect it in various ways. And so this was an enormous breakthrough in our understanding of how things operate. It's also an example of how trying to apply micro concepts directly to macro outcomes isn't always useful. Okay, so aggregate output, just using the terminology we're going to use, it's the amount that's produced in the economy, and we denote it by a capital Y. There's also an amount that people want to buy. So I'm going to state the equilibrium concept that, in a sense, has to apply. We produce a certain amount of goods, that's called Y, and the amount that we want to buy, we in our economy want to buy of the goods that we produce, is called planned aggregate expenditures, AE. It should make sense, though we'd never thought about this before, that equilibrium can only occur when the amount that we're producing is what we want to buy. That if we want to buy less than what we're producing, that's not an equilibrium because we won't sell everything. And if we, as an economy, as a group of people, want to buy more than is currently being produced, then that's also not an equilibrium. Equilibrium can only exist when the amount that we are producing is the amount we want to buy, so that things balance out. Because it's a closed system. We're going to at least talk about it as a closed system today without imports and exports. So whatever is produced, somebody in the economy has to want to buy it, or else it won't get sold. That's the basic concept of equilibrium. This has, even though the concept's relatively simple, it has profound implications, and I want to go through exactly what this all means today and lay this out. It's a really interesting way of looking at things. So today, to be able to focus in on the most prominent issues, the real governing forces here, I'm going to assume that there's no government involved. There's no imports and exports, so we have a closed economy without any leakage on these sides, and that prices and interest rates are fixed. In future lectures, we're going to generalize each of these things. Next lecture, we're going to bring in government and see what it can do in this situation. Then we're going to let prices change. Then we're going to let interest rates change, determine how interest rates are determined. Then we're going to let prices change. Then we're going to put in imports and exports. So it's kind of a gradual expanding of today's work to allow more and more aspects of the macroeconomy to be incorporated. Okay, so we've got an economy that has it's a closed economy with no government. And so there's only two entities that can buy goods in the economy. Consumers buy goods. We buy goods because we want to consume them. That's final use of the good. But also firms buy goods and services in the current economy as a way of building up their productive capacity so that they can produce more goods and services in the future. So for example, if you're building a factory, if you're an entrepreneur and you're building a factory, you're buying goods and services now to be able to create that factory, which will then allow you to produce more in the future. So some of the goods and services that are produced today are purchased by firms in their attempts to increase their productive capacity. That's what investment is called. It's very important when you talk about investment in this analysis that it's the purchase of goods and services by firms for the purpose of increasing future production. It is not, a lot of us think of as investment as what would be today called, what I'm going to refer to in today's lecture as savings, that you save some of your money and you put it in the bank. That's not what we're calling investment now. Investment, as we're defining it today, is the purchase of goods and services for the purpose of increasing production in the future. And then the total amount that the planned aggregate expenditures, AE, the amount that people want to buy in the economy, is just the sum of these two in this very small economy that only has consumers and firms. Okay, so how does this play out then? The most important thing to look at is a feedback loop or definitional feedback that exists in the macroeconomy and affects consumption. In particular, the aggregate output that is produced, if you think of it in dollar terms, is exactly equal to the aggregate income of all the consumers in the economy. For every good that's produced and sold for a certain amount of dollars, those dollars go to somebody. They either go to the workers that were paid wages to produce the good, they go to entrepreneurs in profits, they go somewhere. And so every dollar that is produced, of a good and service that is produced, represents income to somebody in the economy. That means that the amount of income in aggregate to consumers is exactly equal to the aggregate output for the economy. That's the first thing to recognize. Then the second thing to recognize is that, as we all know, we choose to buy more when we have higher income. So as the income of the economy rises, or of consumers rises, which means the same as the aggregate output of the economy rising, then we choose to consume more. Our consumption rises as our income rises, and our income is definitionally the same as a group to the aggregate output of the economy. So we can show this relationship. I seem not to have a little pointer here. Oh, here it is. So this is aggregate output of the economy, which is also income to all consumers. This is the amount that we choose to consume. And this is just a line that represents the two. I'm drawing it as a straight line just because it's easier. You don't need to think about curves. We can get everything we want with a straight line that we're trying to describe today. What it tells you is, first of all, as people's income rises, people consume more. But we don't always consume every bit of every extra dollar. If we're at a very low level of income, we actually probably consume more than our income by dipping into previous savings that we've got. So we consume more just because if we only spent our income, we probably wouldn't be able to live. On the other hand, if we make a whole lot of income, we don't necessarily spend that full amount of the income or buy that we don't buy enough to eat up all of our income. We save some of it for a rainy day. So the idea here is we're looking at one point in time when there's lots of points in time. In the past, we've saved money, and we can dip in those savings to consume more now if we want to. And in the future, we are worried about maybe not having income enough, and so we can save now to protect ourselves in the future. So we're not constrained by our current income for how much we consume. It does affect us, but it doesn't constrain us. And so this consumption curve essentially denotes that. It actually, as I've drawn it and you'll see later, it goes up at less than a rate of 1. If you give a person an extra dollar, they won't necessarily spend that whole extra dollar. They'll save some of it. Or borrow less, or spend out of their past savings less because of it. Now, planned investment, so that's consumption. Planned investment, we're going to assume today that the amount that firms want to invest, that is goods and services that they're going to buy in the economy, is fixed. Why are we doing this? There's 2 reasons. One is because we've assumed interest rates are fixed. And generally, the most important factor for determining whether firms are going to choose to invest is what is the interest rate. They compare how much does it cost to borrow money to buy goods and services now, which will increase my productive capacity in the future, and I make extra profits for that. So the firm's making these calculations of how much extra profit they expect to make relative to how much interest they have to pay. But at a fixed amount of interest, given that the interest is fixed, there's some amount that firms want to invest at that interest rate. We're going to show later when interest rates vary that the amount of investment does vary with the interest rate. We're going to incorporate that. But now today, when we're keeping interest rates fixed, it's natural to have the investment at that interest rate also be fixed. Okay, so we add that on top of the consumption curve. So now this is still aggregate output, which is the income to all people in the economy. This is now the total amount that everyone in the economy wants to buy, consumers and firms combined. Consumers want to buy this amount. We add the amount of investment that firms want to buy, and we have that. So equilibrium, as I've stated before, is when the amount that people want to buy is equal to the amount that is actually produced. That's AE is equal to Y, or given that we now have our aggregate expenditures broken into 2 parts, it's actually the amount that people consume and the amount that firms invest has to equal the amount that we're producing, or else we're not at an equilibrium. So where on the graph that I previously showed could there be an equilibrium? This 45-degree angle tells you the list of points, the set of points that are potentially an equilibrium. This is aggregate output this way. This is how much we're producing. This is how much we want to buy going in this direction. And this is a 45-degree angle, which gives you the set of points at which aggregate output is exactly equal to the amount that you want to buy. So for example, one point on that line is where there's 100 in aggregate output and 100 that people want to buy. Another one's 400, whatever. So that 45-degree line, we know the equilibrium has to be somewhere on there. That's the only place in which the aggregate output is equal to how much we want to buy. So now, putting on our C plus I graph, this consumption plus investment, which is the amount that we want to buy, and that depends on how much is the aggregate income for all people in the economy, which is the same as the amount produced. So it goes up at this rate. There's only one point along here at which it touches this 45-degree line. We know the equilibrium has to be on this, the dotted line. We know that this is what people are actually going to want to buy. The only place on this line that can be an equilibrium is that one, and that is equilibrium output. Let's see what happens when we're away from equilibrium. As always, the insight of why it's equilibrium is more easily obtained when you look at things that aren't equilibrium. Suppose we're at a lower level of output. At this level of output, the income of consumers is low, and so when you take the amount that they want to buy plus investment, people are wanting to buy actually more than what is currently being produced. Essentially, people are dipping into their savings because their income's relatively low and buying more than their current income would allow. after you account for investment. What happens here? Firms have warehouses filled with goods. It's their inventory of goods that they're hoping to sell. And what they will experience is they're producing goods that go into the warehouse, and then they're selling them, and they're actually selling them at a faster rate than they're producing them. So their warehouses start getting empty. Their inventories start decreasing, and they recognize, I'm selling more than I'm actually producing. I can ramp up my production. And so that's what's going to happen. Firms are going to ramp up their production because they see their inventories are decreasing, and they're selling more than they're producing on a flow basis, and so they increase their output. They ramp up production. That not only ramps up production, but it ramps up consumption. Because now, with more production, there's more income for everyone, and more people buy things with higher income. So we move up this direction, and we're moving towards that equilibrium, as you can see. And it happens through this change in inventory, that firms experience their inventories starting to get depleted, and so they start ramping up production to be able to meet the higher demand for their goods than their inventory would have allowed for. The opposite occurs on the other side. Here we've got so much money that we don't want to buy everything that we're producing. Instead, people are trying to save for a rainy day, saving more than firms are investing. And so the amount that we want to buy of all the goods and services that is being produced is less than we're producing. And what happens there? The opposite happens. Firms have their warehouses filled with goods and services, and they start seeing that those warehouses are just getting more and more full, that they're bringing things in quicker than they're selling them. They're not selling all that they're producing on a flow basis. So their inventories start rising, and eventually their warehouses get full, and so they cut back production. Cutting back production means there's less output. It also means there's less income for consumers, and so they cut their consumption. And we move down this curve back towards this equilibrium. The only point at which there's neither a growth in inventories nor a reduction in inventories, both of which would induce firms to change their production output levels, is where we're at that equilibrium point, where the amount that people want to buy is what's actually being produced. Okay, now this explanation that I gave you hinges critically on the concept of inventories, that firms have warehouses that they have their inventories in. When they see the inventory being depleted, they increase their production. When they see their inventories rising, they decrease production because, to keep their warehouses just at what they want. If you read the book, and I want to explain now that there's actually a technical distinction that needs to be made with respect to inventories. It does not, my view is that this adds a wrinkle of complication that isn't worth the mental effort that it takes to do it, but you need to do it just so you'll be able to understand the book and how this actually plays out in the economy. The investment of firms, the investment that they want to make, the investment of a firm is the purchase of goods and services now, which increases their ability to sell goods and services in the future. This includes increases in inventory. So if the firm buys goods and services now, increases their inventory, that means they're holding them not for sale now, but holding them for future. That's equivalent to building a factory. Building a factory is buying goods and services now so that you can sell goods in the future. Buying goods and services now, creating those goods and services now, and putting them in a warehouse so you can sell them in the future is exactly the same from a functional perspective. It's doing things now, buying goods and services now, so as to have the ability to sell more in the future. So investment necessarily includes the change in your inventory. Planned investment includes the planned change in inventory. So if a firm at the beginning of the year says, we don't want to change our inventory at all, then their planned inventory change is 0, and their planned investment is whatever investment they'd do other than increasing their inventory. If a firm, however, some firms might decide, well, this year I think we should increase our inventory by, say, 5%. We should just keep more on hand for purposes of future demand. Then that 5% increase in their inventory is counted as part of their planned investment. And then a way to look at equilibrium is that equilibrium occurs when the planned change in investment in inventories is equal to what actually occurs for the firm. So if the firm had planned at the beginning of the year, I want to have no change in inventory, but they experience a positive change in inventory, that is, their inventory is actually going up by 5%, then that is not equilibrium, because that's going to induce them to reduce their production, because they're increasing their inventories more than they wanted to. Okay. On the other hand, if another firm had planned to increase their inventory by 5%, and then experienced that actually their inventory rose by 5%, that's what they planned. They're not going to adjust their production process in response to that. So it's the difference between planned and unplanned change in inventories that actually gives rise to the story I gave before. So if we go back to this, what's happening here is that what firms and consumers want to buy, including the planned change in inventory, is greater than what is actually being produced. And so firms find that their change in inventory is actually less. They're either losing inventory or they're gaining it less than they wanted, and so they ramp up production. And similarly, the opposite on this side. Here, the planned change in inventories is less than what's actually happening. They maybe plan a 2% increase in inventory, but are experiencing a 5%, and so they'll cut back production. So you need to make that slight distinction. Okay, but in any case, the whole thing works on the idea that we need to have the amount that's being produced purchased by someone. Otherwise, things are going to change. That's the basic story. We can actually use this now to calculate what the equilibrium is going to be. And our government actually does these models. They're in a far more complicated form than I'm describing here. But we have models of the macroeconomy that actually calculate equilibrium. And so you can then see whether we're below equilibrium, above equilibrium, which way things are going to go, and how large the forces are. When I was in college taking this course, I was being taught by Otto Eckstein, who developed the very first economy models of this type. I ended up working at his firm as a research assistant on them. So it's exciting times to be an economist. It's still exciting times. It's always exciting times to be an economist. So what would you do here? Suppose we had a consumption function that had this form. Very simple. People want to spend, even if they don't have any income at all, people are going to consume 100 units of goods and services because you got to consume something just to live. Obviously, income's not going to be 0, but that's what this represents. If people's income were 0, somehow they would still consume by dipping into savings or borrowing or something. And then of every extra dollar that you buy, you're going to spend 75 cents of it. So the remaining 25 cents you either save or you borrow less or dip into your savings less. Let's say that investment's 25, and then the sum of those two is just take these two, 125 plus 0.751. So on our graph then, what that represents is this C plus I curve is a line with an intercept of 125 and a slope of 0.75. And our question is, what is the equilibrium? Equilibrium is determined just by solving this equation. We know that equilibrium has to occur when the amount that people buy for consumption plus the amount that firms buy for investment equals the amount that's produced altogether. And we know that this over here is this amount, and this is just, by definition, the amount we produce. So what this is an equation that has the aggregate output on both sides of it. But notice, it's very easy to jump in and just solve this as math without thinking about the economics. What's actually going on here is this is the aggregate amount that we produce. This over here is the amount that we want to buy, and the amount we want to buy depends on what our income is. It just happens in a closed system that our total income is the amount that we produce, because every dollar of something produced becomes income to someone. So that's what causes this Y to be equal to that Y, or use the same symbol for them. This is actually income to people is what causes their consumption. But it turns out that income to people is exactly the amount that we're producing in the economy. So then all you do is solve this. You bring this over to that side, subtract it, and then you da-da-da, and you get 500. Okay. So we know that this equilibrium is 500. If we're at, say, 400, we know, we're going to move up towards equilibrium. If we're at 700, we know we're going to drop. Now, let's use this information to return to the basic question that that motivated this whole thing and led to Keynes thinking about this in the first place. Suppose this is full employment aggregate output. If everyone in the economy were employed, this is the amount that we would be able to produce. Why is that not equilibrium? Actually, now that we've gone through it this alternative way, why would you expect it to be equilibrium? Why would it happen to be the case that this intersection here happens to occur there? There's absolutely nothing to force it to do so. There's no movement in that direction. There's nothing in here that would induce that. So it actually throws the question back on itself. It's kind of saying, well, you expected equilibrium at full employment. Why did you ever expect that? What force do you think would cause that? And what this is saying is there is no force to cause it. The other way to look at it is we can say, suppose we were at full equilibrium. What is happening here? Full employment. At full employment, we're so rich that we don't want to buy everything that we're producing. We get income, and we're going to save some of it because we want to save it for consumption later, for a rainy day. It's always prudent to do that. And yet, when every individual is deciding to do that, what that means is you can't sell all the goods and services that are being produced. And so firms then have to reduce their production to account for the fact that they can't sell what they're currently producing. And that's what's going to happen here. So essentially, there is no reason to expect equilibrium at full employment. You just think about it. Just because we can produce $14.7 trillion worth of goods, do we actually want to buy all of them? Why should we? And that's essentially what's going on here. There's no reason to expect just because you can produce it that everyone would want to buy it all. And the response to that in the aggregate is that the economy then drops back until all that we're producing is what we want to buy. And there's no reason for that to be full employment. Okay, so now you should be asking yourself the standard microeconomic questions. Well, why don't things adjust? Why don't things adjust? First of all, you'd think, well, if there's unemployed people, why don't wages adjust? So that wages go down, and then you'd hire more workers. Firms would hire more workers. Well, that's probably true. Wages will go down. You'll hire more workers, but it's not going to solve this problem. If workers' wages go down, that's going to push their consumption even further down, and we're going to want to buy fewer of the goods and services that were being produced than we were before. So it's not going to solve this problem. It's not going to induce us by lowering wages. That doesn't induce us as a society, as an economy, to want to buy more goods. If anything, it would induce us to want to buy fewer goods because we're, have less money to spend on it, at least for the lower income side. So that wouldn't do it. How about changes in interest rate? What is actually going on here, and your GSIs and section will explain this entire model in a completely different, not a completely different way, but an alternative way of looking at this, where you're comparing the savings that people make that is the money that they don't spend on consumption, they save, comparing that with the amount that firms invest. What is actually happening here is that the amount that people are saving is greater than the amount that firms are investing. And so the amount that people spend only part of their income on consumption, that gap is not being made up by investment by the firm. Okay? It's only being partially made up. And that's why we firms and the consumers together don't end up buying everything that's being produced. So if savings are higher than investment, that means there's money sitting around for firms to borrow, and that should cause interest rates to drop. So you should ask yourself, well, why doesn't that happen? And the answer is two answers. First, in today's lecture, we've assumed interest rates are fixed. This is the cop-out answer. But I think it's very important to think about that, because to think about this process, you don't have to use interest rates. All you're thinking about is that, how much do people want to buy compared to what we're producing? So it's kind of free from that. But the second thing, and the more fundamental answer, is we're going to determine how interest rates are fixed in the economy in a future lecture. And we're going to find that there's a process that determines equilibrium interest rates. And interest rates have to equilibrate that process. They can't also equilibrate this. And so they can't serve both of those functions. They have to make the demand for investment equal to the supply of investment or money, as we'll see later, and they can't serve that function. So you just hold that in your mind. When we get to that lecture, you'll see how interest rates serve a different function. The other thing that should maybe happen is if people aren't buying enough goods and services now, then maybe prices should drop. And at lower prices, people would buy more. So that would ramp up the economy. Well, there's two answers to that. One, we've assumed prices are fixed, and so that's the trivial answer. But the other answer is, you'll see that there's also a mechanism by which prices are determined. Prices will drop. But prices dropping doesn't necessarily, in itself, cause the amount people want to buy to rise. It will in an indirect fashion, but not as directly as you would think. And in fact, if prices, the only reason you'd want to buy more now instead of later is if you think prices are dropping now, but future prices are not going to drop. Because then the relative prices for today versus tomorrow have gone down. But if prices drop today, the normal expectation is that you'd think prices would be low tomorrow. You know, it's kind of like the best guess of tomorrow is what's happening today. So there's no reason to think that changes in prices are going to move this. Essentially, what we're going to learn as we go through the more and more aspects added to this is there's simply nothing that's going to equilibrate this market. And so we can sit at less than full employment indefinitely. This is a great insight. Everyone believe it? Okay. Now what I want to do is talk about how changes in consumption or investment affect the macroeconomy. Suppose we start out with a particular level of consumption and investment, and we have an equilibrium at Y1. If we increase the investment, if firms all of a sudden decide, okay, at the current interest rate, we're not changing interest rate, but at the current interest rate, we now want to invest more. Why that happens is not really relevant. But firms want to invest more. The same would be true if consumers decided they wanted to consume more at this current, at the current conditions. What that would mean is that we move to a new equilibrium that has a higher aggregate output. So essentially, firms wanting to buy more and consumers wanting to buy more will cause our economy to expand. That makes sense. But what is interesting here is that it's more than a one-to-one relationship. The new equilibrium, if we increased investment by this amount, and the economy just increased by exactly that same amount, would move to that point. So if you increase investment by 100 million, the economy increases by 100 million to meet that demand, we would move to that point. But we actually move further. And this is an extremely important point for determining how to manage the economy, that things have what's called a multiplier effect as they work through the economy. And why is this? This is another thing that you wouldn't get by thinking in micro terms. The reason, and I'm going to go through it more explicitly in the next slides, is that when a firm invests more, buys more goods and services, the economy ramps up to meet that demand. But then the economy is now larger, there's more being produced, and that's more income to people. When people have more income, they then buy more. And so that increases the demand for goods and services even further. The economy ramps up to meet that. That ramping up creates more income to people. They respond to that, and it just keeps going. It eventually dampens out down to nothing. But essentially, in a closed system like this, every increase in demand by one party creates income for another party, which then increases demand, which increases income. And you get this feedback going. And you want to play out what the impact of that whole thing is on the economy. Okay, and to do that, we want to define a new term, which is the marginal propensity to consume. Marginal, one extra. But what is it, one extra? If you give a person an extra dollar of income, what portion of that are they going to consume? So if you give a person an extra dollar, they might spend 90 cents of it and put 10 cents in the bank, or borrow, spend down their savings less than 10% less than they would have otherwise. So in our example of consumption is equal to 100 plus 0.75, then the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. If we know the marginal propensity to consume, we can actually calculate what the impact of a increase in consumption or investment is on the economy. Kind of play out this whole set of ripples and feedbacks. If the marginal propensity, if we have this as our consumption function instead, then the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, meaning you spend 9 cents on every dollar. In the United States, we have a pretty high marginal propensity to consume. So the multiplier, by definition, is the amount that aggregate output increases for every $1 increase in consumption or investment. We know that the multiplier is greater than 1. The question is how much greater than 1? And we can actually work through this and use your high school algebra to calculate what it actually is. So suppose investors or firms decide to spend $1 extra on goods and services, increasing their investment. What that does is ramp up the economy by 1 unit to meet that demand. But then that dollar becomes income to somebody. Somebody gets it, or it's shared among various people. But every dollar that is produced in extra output becomes a dollar of income to someone. So that dollar, it goes to somebody, and they spend that much of it, 75% of it or 90% of it, whatever. So this then is a second increase in amount that people want to buy. It's the original one of the dollar, plus then the impact of the dollar on people's income, which causes them to consume more, and so then people buy more. After that person has spent their portion of the dollar, their 75 cents, that 75 cents then becomes income to somebody, and they spend 75% of it. So this is the amount that was spent here that ramped up the economy. That becomes income to somebody, and they spend that portion of it. You just continue this on out forever, and you get 1 plus the marginal propensity to consume plus marginal propensity to consume squared plus cubed plus all the way out to infinity. How many of you remember your infinite sums? Yeah, you thought these weren't going to be useful, didn't you? You were sitting there in high school thinking, what in the hell am I learning this for? They come useful quite often because these infinite sums have this paradox that even though you're summing over an infinite number of things, it ends up being actually a finite number. As long as the marginal propensity to consume is less than 1, it's going to end up being equal to this. 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. This is what you learned in high school, that this infinite sum, when this is less than 1, is equal to this quantity. So I'm not going to try to rederive that fact. What this tells us is we can calculate, if we know the marginal propensity to consume, if we know how much out of each dollar that a person gets in income, how much they're willing to spend or going to spend, we can calculate the multiplier. So in our example where the marginal propensity to consume, did I scoot that out too quick? Everyone got this? It's 1 divided by 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. So if your marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, the multiplier is 4. 1 divided by 1 minus 0.75, 1 divided by 0.25 is 4. And as the multiplier gets bigger, do I have the other? Yeah. For every $1 of extra investment or consumption, you actually increase the economy by a factor of 4. It's pretty big. So this is, I think, the last slide. And I have other things to say, so don't start getting nervous here. Suppose the equilibrium is 500 and investment increases by 12. If we know the multiplier is 4, meaning that every dollar of investment translates into 4 units of increased output in the economy after you have this full ripple effect, then we know that income is going to rise by 12 by 4, which is 48, and equilibrium is going to move up to that new point. Okay. So, notice that the multiplier is larger the larger the marginal propensity to consume. Quickly, if marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, what is the multiplier? 10. So what this tells us is that a high marginal propensity to consume ends up creating a bigger effect in the economy of changes in consumption or investment. In the graph that this is one thing I think is useful before we even talk about government intervention. Suppose we're here and we're below full employment. In the lecture I've been describing here, I've talked about the marginal propensity to consume. And as always, we talk in terms that facilitate an understanding of what the forces are. So now that you understand what the forces are, we can take a slight variation on it. Everyone doesn't have the same marginal propensity to consume. Give $1 to one person, they might spend 75 cents out of it. You give $1 to another person, they'd spend 90 cents out of it. So different people have different marginal propensities to consume. And in fact, it's pretty closely related to your aggregate income. Who do you think has a higher marginal propensity to consume? Low-income people or high-income people? Low-income people. They're on the edge already. You give them an extra dollar of income, they're going to spend it because they really need to spend it. High-income people, you give them an extra dollar, they might not even notice it. Their marginal propensity to consume could be practically zero. So if what's happening here is that we're away from full employment, one thing that is immediate that could occur, that could move us towards full employment, it would take the government doing it, but and we haven't opened the government. But if you take money away from the rich and give it to the poor, you're taking it away from people that have a low marginal propensity to consume and giving it to people that have a high marginal propensity to consume. That's going to increase the amount of consumption and move us closer to full employment. So redistribution of income is not simply taking money from one person and giving it to another with no impact on the economy. It actually can have a profound impact on our movement towards full employment. That taking money from the rich and giving them to the poor. So Occupy Berkeley. The 1% that doesn't have high marginal propensity to consume, taking money from them and giving it to other people doesn't just help the other people, it actually helps us all by moving us all towards a more robust economy. Okay? Our politicians never talk about this as an issue, but every one of them have learned it. They've all taken this course. Okay, thank you.